There are two common problems doing flash photography if you're using smart triggers in your hot shoe, like the xPro by Godox or the R2Pro by Flashpoint. They're both caused by the same thing that can cause images to be too warm if you're using auto white balance, and also restrict you from getting a live view response when you're changing exposure settings on your camera. Both of these are caused from the exact same issue. That's what I'm going to be talking about in this episode because it's really easy to fix, something that you can do. There's a few different options depending on what camera you have. So I'm going to first show where the problem's coming from, how to identify it on your end if you're seeing this problem, and then also various ways to fix it for various brands of camera. For those who don't know me, my name is Nathan Kuhl. I'm a professional real estate photographer in Southern California, and I've shot literally thousands of homes. I use flash photography for the interiors using the flambient technique, and you may know that I've written some best-selling books on this topic as well. It's a critical point having the proper trigger working the proper way in the hot shoe of the camera, but a lot of times these smart triggers are they're flying off the shelves, they're slapped on the hot shoes, and then you get mixed results out of that. So it's a very easy thing though to address. It's something that I've been doing for a long time. So let's take a look though at where this problem is actually coming from. Both problems of auto white balance and exposure preview stem from using a smart trigger in your camera's hot shoe that communicates with your camera to allow advanced features like TTL and high-speed sync. The reason being is that the handshake between the trigger and your camera is done through the peripheral pins in the hot shoe, which for real estate and many other applications using flash just aren't needed. All that's needed is the center pin. That's what sends the fire signal from the camera to tell whatever's sitting in the hot shoe, a flash or a trigger, to go off. But if those other pins make contact from that trigger or that flash with the camera's hot shoe contacts, then the camera's intelligence kicks in and it does a couple of things. The first thing is that the camera starts to adjust the white balance multipliers if auto white balance is selected. White balance is not really something in EXIF as you know it by setting a number or seeing a Kelvin value. That's more for reference. The multipliers are things that actually take into account then colors across the gamut. So anyways, those multipliers are then adjusted differently. The result is it usually warms up the image when doing flash photography for interior real estate where ambient and flash are involved. When you're doing interior real estate photography, there's always a mix, and that's what we're after, is to try to get that balance. It'll never be 5500 Kelvin coming off of the flashes, and it won't though be something around 3000 Kelvin that would be coming off some of the other lights inside. There would be something in between. The second issue though is, this happens a lot on mirrorless cameras, is since a flash is detected by the camera, it won't change the WYSIWYG preview, the what you see is what you get preview. That's on your EVF and also the LCD screen on a mirrorless camera, and the histogram that you'd see would be inaccurate. Instead, the live views, what they do is when that trigger is detected, it shows an exposure balanced view just for composing your shot, thinking that, well, since a flash will be fired, there's no reason to show what the ambient exposure will look like, but that is not the case when we're doing interior real estate photography. In the first problem with white balance, auto white balance specifically, if you are using a manual Kelvin setting, using manual white balance, then this won't be an issue. It only affects auto white balance, but as I mentioned, this is an important aspect when doing interior real estate photography, is it can be very difficult and auto white balance is often preferred. And I do have some videos on setting either one down in the description for this video, as well as some other material that you might be interested in with my real estate photography series, so check out those links. But there's also more to it than just this. Even if you were to use Kelvin settings for your white balance, we've still got the second issue. The second problem makes the real estate flambient workflow difficult. Doesn't matter what you're doing for white balance. What you want to be able to do, it's ideal to see in real time where your ambient exposure should be, take an ambient shot, and then quickly adjust exposure for the flash shots by being able to see in real time where that ambient light is dropping off and also where window pulls begin, and then start firing flash on that. Without that real-time feedback, you really don't know exactly what exposure, what shutter speed you would want to change to after taking your ambient shots. The solution is to configure what I call center pin isolation. It's where you make sure that only the center pin on the trigger makes contact with the hot shoe of the camera and that no other pins do. There are a few ways to do this, but it will vary by camera. So let's take a look at some fixes, some caveats, and how to confirm this will work. Most cameras, except for Sony, use a standard hot shoe design that's in accordance with the international standard ISO 518, where the center pin is always in the exact same spot. This makes it easy then, so each camera maker can put that in the center, and then everything can make contact with it, and then they can put other pins in various locations, and they do. Canon puts them in different locations, Nikon, Lumix, all of them have them in different locations, and this is ideal though for us to fix this issue since those peripheral pins will be in different places. Sony is a completely different animal, completely different. It uses what's known as a multi-interface shoe, and that offsets the center pin, making the fix a bit more difficult. So first, let's talk about cameras other than Sony, like Nikon, Canon, Fuji, Olympus, Lumix, and others, and then let's talk about the outlier, Sony. On almost all cameras but Sony, you can use a non-camera branded trigger. So for instance, if you're using a Nikon camera, then use a smart trigger for Canon. That's what I do. I have Nikon cameras, so I just use xPro for Canon. And for Canon cameras, just use a Nikon trigger. Same way with Fuji, Olympus, Lumix, all these other cameras, just use some other brand as long as it's not Sony. The center pin will always align on all these various brands except Sony, but the other pins won't. This provides us then that center pin isolation. Another option that's a little inexpensive is that, more than just buying a brand new trigger, is that you can use a single pin adapter. Once again, this is for everything but for Sony. So this allows only the center pin to make contact with the hot shoe. So if you already have a trigger for your camera, you don't want to buy a new one, then this is a less expensive option. It's just that these adapters just have that one pin on the bottom, one pin on the top. You just slide your trigger into that, put that into the hot shoe, you have center pin isolation all the time. Another option, some photographers will put paper or tape over the other contacts. It's not something I recommend for a variety of reasons. However, for testing purposes, you can put a piece of paper over all but the center contact in the hot shoe, which should provide temporary center pin isolation, at least long enough to test this. If you try to keep that piece of paper in there all the time, it's eventually going to wear down. You're going to get some type of contact, at least maybe even intermittent contact from those pins to those contacts. If you try to put tape in there, you're just putting sticky tape on top of an expensive camera. I just wouldn't do that, not unless you're going to put some type of adapter up there and start modifying the adapter with putting like some tape over it or something like that. But I wouldn't put tape in your camera's hot shoe at all. But you can think about using just a piece of paper cutout and just so you can at least test this, which I'll get to here in just a second. Another option, I know some photographers do, I'm not a real big fan of it, that Autorama sells a single pin trigger that's compatible with the R2Pro line, which is the same as all the Godox stuff. It's known as the R2SP. But I found this to be a pain to use and I really don't recommend it. It's just not the same type of display. It doesn't give as much control. It's bulkier and just more difficult to use. I can't use it fast enough like I can the slanted ones like the R2Pro or the xPro. I have a link, by the way, to the review on the R2SP if you want to see it, some of my thoughts on using it, and I've got also a link to that in the description for this video. But either way, when it comes to Sony, there are two problems to these fixes as Sony doesn't follow industry standards. The first thing, when we take a look at the center pin in the hot shoe, it is offset compared to where the standard hot shoes have their center contact. There's a little bit of an overlap that occurs on this, but the manufacturing tolerances can be a problem. So that's why sometimes it will work, sometimes it won't. But that's the biggest problem, is that Sony's center pin in that multi-interface connector is just not in the same position exactly as the other standard hot shoes are. The other issue is that it's got the multi-interface wire contacts on its edge. Instead of having these various pins like everybody else does, then it has these wired contacts. Well, those are very difficult to cover up. So if you were to try to do the paper technique, which is putting a piece of paper over your contacts, well, you really can't do that with these wired contacts. So that makes it all the more difficult. And once again, like I mentioned, these manufacturing tolerances mean that sometimes standard hot shoe center pins will touch the Sony center contact, but sometimes they won't. This is why some Sony shooters can use a Canon xPro trigger in their Sony hot shoe, but others say they can't get it to work at all. It's all because of what you might have gotten in its manufacturing tolerances, which can be off by easily a millimeter. So if this becomes the case, then you can consider getting a Sony to Canon Nikon adapter and modifying the top of the adapter by putting some paper over the other contacts and leaving that adapter connected to your trigger so you don't wear out the paper. The next thing you need to do is to test your single pin isolation configuration to make sure it will resolve both the auto white balance and exposure preview problems. If one works, I'm sure the other one will work as well. So if you're using the manual Kelvin settings, great, but if you want to make sure that the exposure preview is fixed, this is the same way. But here I'll cover it for both. So the first thing you want to do is, for the auto white balance issue, you want to make sure that you take 2 flash shots. Take one shot that's flashed with the trigger making full contact. Then take another flash shot using only center pin isolation, whatever configuration you're using, whether it be just initially the piece of paper with the center pin cut out so you can test this, or whether it's one of the hardware solutions. The next thing then is to do a comparison of the 2 images to see how the white balance differs. You should see, comparing the 2 images, a noticeable different white balance, with the all pin trigger shot being warmer than the single pin contact shot. You can also look at the white balance sliders as well. Here I was using Nikon Studio, but you can use Lightroom or other software, and you should see that the center pin only shot is cooler than the all pin contact shot. This is often the case with interior real estate photography, since we're never usually at the 5500 Kelvin. And once again, you can do these test shots just at home, just throw away footage just to see really quick if you're seeing this problem. Next, compare the EXIF of each image and see if it shows that a flash was fired from a known device. Once again, here I'm using Nikon Studio. Lightroom might not have as much information there, and so you might have to use a more advanced online EXIF viewer, making sure that you can see the flash information. When using all pin contact, you should see a known device. In this instance, a Nikon trigger by Godox falsely advertised itself as a Nikon Speedlight, the SB900, when sitting in the hot shoe of a Nikon camera. But in the image using center pin isolation, no flash was detected, even though the flash was indeed fired. This is the root of the problem. The center pin will have a fire signal sent to it no matter what, as long as flash is enabled through your camera menus, but the camera won't do anything else, since it can't identify what flash, if any, was sitting in the hot shoe, so it just ignores it. It still sends the signal, it knows that something else could be there that needs it, but it just isn't going to do anything else to try to adjust the images. Taking a look at the exposure preview, it's just a matter of seeing if the WYSIWYG preview changes when you adjust exposure. It's that what you see is what you get preview. When you're changing the shutter speed on your camera while the trigger is turned on, if you're using center pin isolation, you should be able to have the trigger in the hot shoe turned on, increase the shutter speed, and you'll see real-time display. If it isn't changing, then you don't have center pin isolation. Somehow something else has gone wrong. But once again, all you need to do is just change that shutter speed with the trigger turned on in the hot shoe and make sure that your live view is changing, and so is the histogram. The alternative to this, no matter what camera brand you have, Sony, Nikon, otherwise doesn't matter, it's less ideal, but it will work without making any changes to your gear setup. It involves two steps. One, you can always set your white balance in manual Kelvin, which as mentioned earlier is not always ideal for real estate photography. This solves the auto white balance issue. I have a video on that with a link in the description. Second thing, for the exposure preview problem, turn off the trigger in the hot shoe when you're taking your ambient shot. Keep it off while adjusting exposure for the flash shot, then turn the trigger on to take the flash shot and window pull. Some cameras allow you to also assign function buttons to turn flash off and on in the camera, which can also work, but it's faster just to turn off the flash trigger and sitting in the hot shoe. Just flick that off and on. This can be time consuming, it's inconvenient, so it's not necessarily my recommendation. I'd rather use one of the hardware solutions. So as you may know, if you've been following my channel for a while, I did a video similar to this some years back showing where this problem originated from. Now, there was a lot of blowback from the equipment manufacturers, including Autorama, who's handling the Flashpoint line, and also a little bit from Godox as well. Godox was more acceptant of this and realized there was an issue. But it hasn't been resolved. In fact, the equipment manufacturers are saying that this is a feature. And while I can say that this possibly could be a feature for some genres of photography, this is a very critical point that's a hindrance for doing genres like real estate photography and other creative work where you want to be able to have control over not just how your white balance is affected regardless of flash, but also how your exposure can then be set quickly enough regardless of flash, knowing how you're going to be implementing those things. It would be a very easy thing to fix, and older Godox triggers had something for center pin isolation where you could then use it in single pin mode, but users have had mixed results with that, and those are older triggers that just don't have the nice feature set that you do find on some of the newer like the xPro and the R2Pro. So this would be a very simple fix of Godox and Flashpoint you're watching. Just simply put in a menu item, please, that would just allow us to shut off all signals from every pin except for the center pin in the hot shoe. That's all that would be needed. That way, if somebody wanted to use TTL and high-speed sync, they could go into the menu, turn that on, but if they want to do something creative or like for real estate photography, and we don't want those pins to make contact, then just shut those off. Until that happens, there are fixes like I've shown in this video that work very well. I've been doing them for years, no problem at all. Makes my photography a lot quicker and also a lot more accurate. I hope this video was useful for you and that you can apply these same techniques.